Good evening, everybody. My name is Ian Davis. I'm Deputy Head of Department of Education here at the University, and it's my pleasure, absolute delight, to be working with very many colleagues and students in the Department of Education to coordinate our 50th anniversary events. On behalf of the department, it's a delight to welcome everyone here to a very important event in our 50th birthday celebrations, and a particular pleasure to welcome Dr. Maggie Aderin-Pocock, who's our speaker this evening. Before I hand over to my colleague, Professor Judith Bennett, Head of the Department of Education and Science Education Expert, who will introduce the lecture, and Maggie, I'd like to say a few words about the department. Education is one of the founding departments of the university. There were just 6 of them in 1963. The University of York as a whole has done extremely well during its first 50 years. York's one of the world's top 100 universities and one of the best universities in the country for its teaching and research. Last year it was awarded the accolade of being the best university in the UK under 50. So I think we've got to lose that. Okay, but hang on to it for a moment. From the very beginning, under the leadership of the first Vice-Chancellor and former head teacher, Lord James, the Education Department was and always has been at the heart of the university. Whereas many university departments of education are literally and metaphorically down the road, away from the main campus at a former teacher training college that had been taken over by an expanding university, the Education Department at York has always been centrally located on the campus, and it's always been involved in all major developments. It's one of the things that I've found always extremely attractive about York. It takes education across all departments seriously. It takes the Education Department very seriously. The Education Department has experienced massive success during its first 50 years. Most recent research assessment exercise recognised us as the 8th best department of education in the country. Most recently published University League Table, The Guardian, puts the York Education Department as the 6th best in the country. Our research is excellent. Our teaching standards for undergraduates, graduates, and student teachers are highly impressive. Our completion rate for PhD students is outstanding. We've rapidly expanded, doubling in size during the last 5 years. How do we do all this? Well, we've got an outstanding head of department, outstanding staff, academic and administrative, outstanding students. We're never complacent, we're inclusive, diverse, international, and by working in a collegial, mutually supportive manner, we're focused on improving education for all. The department has a number of events planned to celebrate its first 50 years. Tonight's talk is one of a series of public lectures with distinguished guest speakers. We've had so far Professor Maggie Snowling of Oxford University. We're going to have Patrick Spottiswoode, Director of Education at the Globe, in the autumn. Also in the autumn, Estelle Morris, former Secretary of State for Education. We had an event in March to celebrate our work with schools and a birthday party in May. We'll have an academic conference in July and a reunion for former staff and students in November. Students in the department are working on a series of events to raise money for charities that support education. Please go to our web pages to sign up for remaining events. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all my colleagues in the department who have worked so hard to organise our 50th birthday celebrations, and tonight's lecture has been coordinated by Dr. Benedetta Bassetti, who's here on the front row. Thank you very much indeed. There'll be time for questions after Maggie's talk. It is, Maggie's talk is being filmed, but don't worry, the filming stops after Maggie's talk. So question and answer, you won't be recorded. Okay, that stops at that point. And everyone's very welcome to a drink, a soft drink or an alcoholic drink outside after the talk is finished. Okay, so without further ado, thank you again for coming, and I'll hand over to Professor Bennett to introduce Dr. Aderin-Pocock. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and I'd like to add my welcome to Ian's. I think there's a sense in which Dr. Maggie Aderin-Pocock doesn't need any introduction, as there can be few people here who haven't seen her on the television communicating her enthusiasm for science to young people. And given her success and her reputation today, it's hard to imagine that she struggled as a pupil when she first went to school in London. Much of the struggle was due to her dyslexia, which led to her being put in remedial classes for reading and writing, Fortunately, as it so often does, science came to the rescue. And from an early age, Maggie found science and astronomy in particular fascinating. And once she started to study science at school, everything else fell into place. She ended up taking maths, physics and chemistry and biology at A level before going on to study at Imperial College, firstly taking an undergraduate degree in physics and then going on to gain her PhD in mechanical engineering. Interestingly, she still feels that gaining her PhD was one of the biggest challenges she's faced, so for anyone studying their PhD at the moment, you will empathise with that. Although Maggie ultimately became a very successful student, it is fortunate for us that she chose to ignore the first bit of careers advice she was given by a teacher in her school. On learning that Maggie wanted to be an astronaut when she grew up, the teacher advised her to try nursing, as that was more suitable and also involved science. Maggie's worked on many projects, from private industry to government contracts to academic research. Her early career was spent with the Ministry of Defence, where she worked on early warning systems for missiles and on the development of handheld instruments to detect landmines. In 1999, she was awarded a fellowship from the Science and Technology Facilities Council, which took her back to Imperial College, and then to Chile, where she worked on the Gemini Telescope. Since that time, she's been involved in many projects, including working on the James Webb Telescope, which will ultimately replace the Hubble Space Telescope. Maggie first started working on public engagements with science when she was trying to recruit space scientists to work on her projects. She rapidly came to realise that for many young people, a career involving science was not something they wanted to pursue. Maggie decided she wanted to do something about this and pass on her feeling for the power and wonder of science as a subject. So she initiated a scheme in which she talks to young people from all walks of life about the excitement of science and astronomy and how it's changed her life. She tells young people why she is a scientist. She lets them know about science careers and their diversity, that they can even be well paid, and they're open to everyone regardless of race, gender and class. As well as the immense satisfaction she gets from her scientific work, Maggie also gets satisfaction from her work with young people. To date, she's talked to well over 100,000 young people, some of whom have gone on to study science themselves as a result of talking to Maggie. Her TV work includes acting as a scientific consultant for the 2009 miniseries Paradox, appearing on Doctor Who Confidential, presenting Do We Really Need a Moon and In Orbit, How Satellites Rule Our World on BBC Two. And in 2009, Maggie was awarded an MBE for her services to science and education. Just to interject with a more personal note, while Maggie was studying for her A-levels, I was coping with the challenges of my own PhD. And that looked at ways in which more young people, particularly young women, could be encouraged to study science subjects and pursue careers in science. And this is something that's remained very important to me throughout my career. So I think you can see why it's a very particular pleasure for me, both from the background I come from and on behalf of the department, to welcome Maggie to York as part of our 50th anniversary celebrations. I know we're going to be in for an exciting evening. So Maggie, thank you.
It's always scary when you get an introduction like that, because it makes me sound really interesting. And so the pressure's on now. So what I want to talk to you tonight about is the power of dreams. Because I think dreams can transform lives. And I think we take our dreams for granted. And I want to tell you about my dream. And I want to tell you about how it has taken a black dyslexic kid from a broken home in London and turned her into a space scientist. But I also want to talk to you about, will I ever reach the stars? Because my dream was that I wanted to go into space, and from watching Star Trek, I wanted to go to the stars. It seemed like quite a natural thing to do. I mean, they just sort of, put warp power on and they're there. So that was my dream, and I want to talk about how close we are to me fulfilling it. So a quick CV, so you can tell who the strange woman in front of you is. So yeah, Maggie Aderin-Pocock. Actually, most of this has been covered. But in terms of career, I started at Imperial College, and until recently I was working at a company called Astrobiology Limited. Has anyone here heard of Astrobiology Limited? A stunned silence in the room. Yes. Astrobiology Limited is the third largest space company in the world, and it is totally European based. So we have divisions in France, in Germany, we have 3 sections here in the UK as well. And effectively what we do is we build satellites. And we build satellites, sort of bespoke satellites for European Space Agency, looking at climate change, James Webb Space Telescope, which I'll mention later, but also commercial satellites, satellites for telecommunications and things like that. And the satellites are very big business, and space is big business. The government are quite interested in space, because space at the moment looks as if it's recession-proof. And you can't say that about many industries at the moment. And also, space is manufacturing here in the UK. And you can't say that about many industries in the UK at the moment. So space is very exciting. As well as that, I was mentioned the fellowship from STFC. STFC have been wonderful to me. They are a government organisation, and they fund effectively big research. So they used to subscribe to the European Space Agency, they subscribe to the Large Hadron Collider. They let big science happen. And over the last 6 years, they've been giving me support so I can come out and do things like this. As well as I have my own company, a very little company, but called Science Innovation Limited, and I do some television work. Now, unfortunately, I dropped my laptop, so my sound card isn't working, but I'm just going to show you a clip of the sort of things I get up to on TV. So I'm hoping you can hear this. No. No, that's on. Oh, you're not getting that at all, are you? No. It's me in a darkened studio doing some very odd things, but I think I'll leave that and go on to the clangers instead. Because people often ask me, I'm sort of a black dyslexic kid, an astronaut. It doesn't seem like a sort of a natural correlation. Why did I have that dream? And why, to a certain extent, did I not get sophisticated and grow out of it? And I put the blame totally in the hands of the clangers. Because I've got a 3-year-old daughter now, and so I've got an opportunity to watch the clangers all over again. And they're magical. They're so sweet. And for those of you who don't know, these are the clangers. And they lived in a planet in space. And actually, if you watch the episodes, which I have been doing, each episode at the start is different. But it sort of starts off, this is planet Earth. But now let's travel through space to visit another planet where other creatures live. And so I grew up as a 3-year-old with this ringing in my ears. And I decided then and there I was going to go and visit the clangers. I didn't care how far away they were, I wanted to visit the clangers. And what made that sort of slightly more logical was I was born in sort of 1968, so the birth of the space era. So York University is celebrating 50 years. The space era is just over 50 years old. Now, when I think about this, in that time, a lot has happened in space. We've only been doing space science for 50 years. The first satellite, Sputnik, was launched in 1957. And yet space is part of our lives, our everyday lives, and we take it for granted. So space science has come a long way, and I think it's got a lot more to offer in the future. But I grew up hearing about people like Yuri Gagarin, the first person to leave the surface of the Earth and travel into space. And of course, Neil Armstrong, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. These words were ringing in my ears as I was growing up. So travelling into space seemed like quite a natural thing to do. But as was mentioned, I told my teacher, I want to be an astronaut. And then, Maggie, with the dyslexia and stuff. But some dreams stick. And I do feel at the moment that we have a deficit. We, over the years, I think we've been encouraging our kids not to aspire, not to have wild, fantastic dreams, not to reach for the stars in case they don't make it. But I'll argue that the probability of me reaching the stars is very, very slim, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. But by having that dream, I've gone much further than I ever would have otherwise. So I reckon we should be encouraging all our kids to reach as high as they can, have mad, impossible dreams. You may never actually reach fulfilment of that dream, but I think no one lies on their deathbed and thinks, oh, well, I didn't quite do that, but you're happy because you've achieved things. So I think we should aspire and encourage our kids to aspire as much as possible, because it's worked for me. But also, one of the other things is when I told people I wanted to be a scientist, they sort of gave me a double take. You're not going to be a scientist. And when I go out to school kids and speak to them, they're slightly surprised when I tell them I'm a scientist. And I think usually when people think of a scientist, they think of someone who looks a little more like this. Now, this is one of my heroes. This is Ernest Rutherford. And it is, I love the work he did because he did very simple experiments that looked into the heart of atoms. And so, and also he was quite clumsy. And then he was working in Oxford, and there were large signs over some of the equipment, effectively saying Rutherford, keep away. But they were a bit more general, a bit more kind. But yeah, he used to clump and bump into things, and I do quite a bit of that myself. So I think we've got quite a bit in common. But on the other hand, usually when people think of scientists, they think of someone who's white and who's male and who is also very, very serious. And I think most people think of scientists, especially young kids, when they think of a scientist, they think of someone who's really serious. Because most people assume that if you're a scientist, you have a brain the size of a small planet. And when you have a brain that large, you've got no time for fun and games. You're thinking deep thoughts all the time. Now, I've got another picture here who I'm sure you'll recognise. And of course, this is Albert Einstein. And I'd like to show this picture to school kids as well, because this is another sort of stereotypical image we have of a scientist. Now, of course, he's white and he's male again, but this time he's not looking quite so serious. And this is another view we have, and we see it in films all the time. In films, the baddie always has a German or a British accent. And you know, he's usually, Mr. Bond, I'm going to take over the world and turn it into jam! And they do that evil laugh. I practice that in front of the mirror, actually. So this is another view that we have of the scientist. So white, male, and sometimes quite crazy. I do that bit quite well. But now when I go out to school kids, especially the younger kids, I like to show them this picture. And I say, spot the scientist. This is a picture of me and my husband on our wedding day. And I like to show this picture because often when people think of a female scientist, they think of someone wearing dungarees, carrying a spanner and covered in grease. And I can do that, but it's nice to show the feminine side as well. And when I say spot the scientist, most of the younger kids will automatically go for my husband. But the fact is, both my husband and I became scientists and engineers, not because we have brains the size of a small planet, because unfortunately we don't. And we both suffer from dyslexia. We became scientists because we're inquisitive. We ask why. For me, it was the stars. I can look up at the night sky and it brings tears to my eyes because it's so beautiful. And it's so beautiful that I want to find out more about it. And with my husband, he studied electrical engineering. And he has a habit of taking computers apart, so you have to be careful when you're near him. So these are the inspirations. But it's about asking why. It's about being inquisitive. And most kids, like my daughter, she's going, I have a rule at home that she can ask 5 whys and then she has to stop. Because she was like, why? 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 And sometimes it's almost a bit unfortunate that kids go through the education system and we take away that inquisitive part from them. They stop asking why. But for those kids, the way it lingers, they, I think, are ripe material for becoming scientists. And that's why I became a scientist, because I keep on asking why. But also, the idea of going into space just really thrills me. And I like to talk about life in space. Recently, Chris Hadfield was doing some tweets and sending back some videos, but this is some quite old footage. But I just like to talk about life in space. I mean, like this chap is drinking Ribena, and life in space can be quite messy. And when I see kids today, they haven't often seen this sort of footage, so it's new material for them. That's why I want to go into space. I want to eat my banana like that. But this is my favourite bit. On a planet Earth, I don't stand a hope in hell of doing that. But in space, everybody is a gymnast. So that's life in space. But I like to get kids thinking as well. That's life in space, and it looks like fun. But it makes some technical challenges. For instance, you saw the chap with the Ribena. You squirt a fluid in the air in space, and it sort of floats around you. So if that's the case, how do you go to the loo in microgravity? So if you think about it, I mean, you want to go to the loo, and you want to go to the loo, but it could be really, really messy. So I talked to the kids about this because they love the yuck factor. And what I like to do is actually get them to suggest what sort of technology could we use. Because the pictures of Yuri Gagarin and Neil Armstrong, when they first went into space, they sort of did what my daughter does. She wears a nappy. But if you're going to be on the International Space Station for 6 months, if you're going to travel to Mars, or a journey of 8 months, you don't want to be wearing a nappy. So we need some space technology. And so then I give actually a live demonstration of how to go to the loo in space, which I shall do now. Don't worry, this shouldn't get too crude. But first of all, this is a picture of the loo on the International Space Station. So the first thing you do is, you're in space, and I can imagine being in space. I often dream about this. So, I'm having fun, I'm eating my banana, I'm doing somersaults, and then I need to go to the loo. So the first thing I do is I wander over to the cubicle and shut the door very firmly, because this could be messy. Okay, the next thing I do is I sit down on the loo. Okay, this seems quite natural, but I'm in that microgravity environment. So halfway through, you start floating off. So the first thing you do when you sit down is you use these 2 struts to strap yourself in place. Okay, you're down, and now you're going nowhere. Okay, Next, because you don't want to be floating in a sea of urine, what you do is you have a hose with a vacuum pump. So you flip the switch, get the pump working, apply it to the right sort of places, everything gets sucked away, you wipe everything down, wipe your hands, and you've been to the moon in space. But you see, very everyday things, and this is one of the things that Chris Hadfield was showing, very everyday things like brushing your teeth in space become a lot more challenging, and perhaps in some ways a lot more fun. So I've been lucky enough that although I haven't reached my desire of getting into space, I have worked on instruments that have gone into space, and I've worked on a wide range of instruments to date. So this is a satellite called Aeolus, and it's part of the European Space Agency's Living Planet programme. And what Aeolus is designed to do is actually sit up in space and look down at planet Earth. Often when people think of satellites, they think of sort of the big satellites looking out into space. But a large number of satellites are Earth observation satellites, and they're telling us more about our planet. And they're helping solve some of the big problems we have in our lives today. So what Aeolus was doing was it was measuring wind speed through the Earth's atmosphere by sending pulses of UV light into the atmosphere. Some of this light scatters off particles. That tiny amount of scattered light can be picked up by the telescope, and we can actually, by using a process called Doppler, so looking at small shifts in the colour of the light, we can work out how that particle is moving under the influence of the wind. So Aeolus was helping us understand climate change. But at the same time, I've worked on satellites that look deep into space. This is the James Webb Space Telescope, the largest space telescope ever built. And it is mammoth. This is a scale model of it, which they take around the world, actually. I bumped into it a few years ago in Dublin, and I've also seen it in Baltimore in the States. But the James Webb Space Telescope is a monster, and that is it in its deployed mode. But to get it into space, it's actually folded up via a process of virtually origami to actually get it into the launch bay and send it into space. And I must admit, I'm immensely proud to be one of the thousands and thousands of scientists across the world that has worked on this project. And what we were making, me and my team, I'm a project manager, so me and my team make small subsystems that go in the James Webb Space Telescope. But to be part of something so amazing, and I just can't wait till sort of maybe 5 years' time when we start getting data back and start seeing what the telescope sees and getting a better understanding of the universe by using things like this. So being part of being a scientist is part of being a member of a large team, and the sum of the parts can be greater than the end result can be greater than the parts sometimes. So I have had a few ideas of getting into space. In fact, rather embarrassingly, I did apply for the European Space Agency's astronaut programme a few years ago, but too many cakes, I guess. I didn't actually get selected for the programme. So over the years, I've been sort of looking at my TV career, looking at my space career, and wondering if there's some way of combining the two. And so a few years ago, I came up with an idea which would look at Big Brother. Now, the Big Brother franchise has been going on for a number of years now. It was on Channel 4, it recently went to Channel 5, but I think it's getting a bit stale. So what I want to do is I want a Big Brother to team up with interplanetary travel. What my suggestion is, you don't have a Big Brother house, you have a Big Brother spaceship. And on this Big Brother spaceship, this spaceship is going to travel to Mars. Now, the journey to Mars is quite doable. It takes about 8 months, and we have virtually all the technology we need to do it. What is stopping us at the moment is one of the biggest challenges is the cost. So what we do is we set 10 passengers from all around the world, and we set 10 passengers all around the world, and we put them on the spaceship. And just like Big Brother, we have cameras everywhere, real-time coverage. Possibly not in the loop, that could be messy, but real-time coverage. But as I was saying, there are some challenges associated with this idea. There is the cost. The cost of this is of the order of 50 to 100 billion pounds, $1 billion pounds. When you get up that high, the conversion rate doesn't make much difference. But it is going to be an incredibly expensive challenge. And also, there is another problem with this idea, and that is it's eviction. For those of you who are familiar with the Big Brother scenario, you get sort of being voted out of the house. Now, if you're halfway to the Mars and then you suddenly get the announcement, could Dr. Maggie Aderin-Pocock please make your way to the airlock? You've been evicted from the Big Brother spaceship. Have a nice day. That's not the sort of thing that I think people are going to want to cover. So, to mitigate the cost, we sell the television rights across the world. They did this with the Premiership football about, 5 or 6 years ago, and they got billions. If we have passengers from all around the world, and sell the TV rights, I think we could probably fund a project like this. And at the moment, I don't see what else is going to fund a project like this. So we need something like this to get out there. Regarding eviction, the solution is quite simple, but a bit daring. Because for eviction, rather than evicting people from the spaceship, what we do is only 2 people return to Earth. Because one of the challenges and one of the costs of a project like this is you get people to Mars, in the 8-month journey, they spend some time on Mars, and then you have to bring them home. If you're bringing 10 people back from Mars, that's incredibly expensive. But now we know that life is potentially possible on Mars, or some form of life. We've found water at fairly low altitudes on the Martian surface. We can analyse the Martian soil and perhaps use that combined with other chemicals to grow things on the Martian soil. So this is actually my retirement plan. I'm still breaking it to my husband. He hasn't signed up yet, but this is my retirement plan. And a little while ago, I made a film about this. But one of the things I find quite interesting is I had this idea probably about 6-7 years ago. And I was at the Edinburgh Science Festival recently, and I was actually asked to sort of do an interview. And I was asked to interview the managing director of an organisation called Mars One. And I sort of sat down and started chatting to this chap. And this chap had the same idea, but except he's putting it into fruition. He is actually recruiting people to make a one-way journey to Mars. And I was gobsmacked, you know, but that's my mad idea, and someone's doing it. So it just goes to show, and he has employed the creator of Big Brother as one of his advisors. So mad ideas can come to fruition. And in the next few years, in the next 10 years, we might actually see someone going to Mars on a Big Brother spaceship. But one of the things is, my dream was to reach the stars, and our understanding of the universe over the last 100, 200, 300 years has changed radically. 300, 400 years ago, we thought that the Earth was the centre of the universe. It made sense. We saw the sun rotate around us. We saw Earth as everything sort of rotating around Earth. But then some people came along and they used new technology to look out there, and they realised that that wasn't quite right. You looked at some things and they just didn't have the right motion to be rotating around us. So then people like Copernicus came along, and actually other people, some of the Greeks actually came up with the heliocentric universe, the idea of the sun at the centre of the universe. And so these ideas started to proliferate through, and with better technology, we got a better understanding of the universe. And that's what I see my role as. I build instrumentation that help us understand the universe. One of my favourite jobs in the past was working out here. This is the Gemini Telescope in Chile. Now, to put this into context, the Gemini Telescope is one of the biggest telescopes in the world. This is a picture of the primary mirror, and the mirror is 8 metres in diameter. I'm just trying to look out 8 metres. Probably from at the end of this bar here, probably to those seats over there, to the end of those seats, that is about 8 metres. So this telescope has 8 metres of light gathering power. Now, this chap in the middle, his name was Francisco, and his job was every week he had to sort of effectively spray and polish the mirror. And a mirror that size, that's quite a hard job. But the thing is, over the years we've been building bigger and better telescopes. And the reason we're doing this is because a telescope is a light gathering bucket, and the bigger your bucket, the more light you can gather. So this is part of a series of telescopes. This is the Gemini Telescope where I worked, but we've also got things like the VLT, which stands for rather unimaginatively, the Very Large Telescope. And so some astronomers have sort of limited imagination. But that is a series of 4 8-metre telescopes in the Atacama Desert. But recently, UK subscribed to another project called the ELT, which stands for the Extremely Large Telescope. And this is a telescope that's going to be 42 metres in diameter. And I really hope to see that sort of up and running within my lifetime. But one of the things I don't know if I will see is a telescope called the OWL. And that stands for the Overwhelmingly Large Telescope. But that telescope will be 100 metres in diameter. So that's a telescope the size of a football pitch. Now, with a telescope like this, in the traditional sort of view of a telescope, you usually get sort of someone, usually wearing a sort of a dicky bow and wearing a tweed coat, looking through the eyepiece of a telescope, almost sort of like a captain on a ship. Now, since then, we've moved away from this. Telescopes are so big these days that with that amount of light gathering power, depending on what you look at, you could probably burn your retinas because you just have too much light coming through. So we can take images of what's out there in space. And I think some people have seen the images taken by the Hubble Space Telescope, sort of quite mind-bogglingly beautiful stuff. But we want to do more with the light we gather from telescopes. And this is one of the first projects I worked on in astronomy. And this is a picture of an instrument called BHROS, which stands for Bench-Mounted High-Resolution Optical Spectrograph. Snappy, huh? But what BHROS did was something very, very simple. It took all that light gathered by the telescope and it fed it into an instrument called a spectrograph. And this is what it developed. It developed a rainbow of the starlight that we gathered. Now, although it's very pretty, why would we do this? Well, by taking the rainbow of a star, we can tell all sorts of things about it. We can actually look at these sort of little absorption bands. Each one of these absorption bands tells us of a chemical reaction that could be taking place in the star. It can also tell us about chemicals that lie between us and the star, because chemicals absorb certain wavelengths of light. So by having a sort of a deficit in these areas, we can actually see what chemical reactions are taking place in a star. Also, by looking at the bands and sort of the frequency of the bands and where the bands are, we can actually detect what we call blue shifts and red shifts. And that tells us if the star is moving towards us or moving away from us. So by sitting in a lab in Chile and building this instrument, we can actually look into the heart of stars. So my dream was always to travel to the stars, but I think this is getting me a step closer. This star could be billions of light years away, but by gathering this data, we can look into its heart and see what it's doing. So, why build these instruments? The James Webb Space Telescope is costing of the order of $18 billion. That's a lot of money to put out there. So why do we do it? Well, I like to show you this picture, because to get a full understanding of what's happening out in the universe, we want to look at a broader range of colours as possible. And this is the electromagnetic spectrum. So right up here, radio waves, we go into millimetre, infrared, visible light, but that's what we're all familiar with, but that's what we're bathed in here today. And then we've got sort of microwaves, X-rays and gamma rays. That's the electromagnetic spectrum. But here we have the Earth's atmosphere. And one of the things is that things like X-rays, gamma rays, they don't actually penetrate the Earth's atmosphere. Now this is jolly good news for us, because X-rays and gamma rays, as we know, they can disrupt our DNA. And this is one of the challenges that astronauts face. When they go up above the Earth's atmosphere, suddenly they are bathed in radiation from the sun. So we have an atmosphere that protects us. But on the other hand, if we want to actually know what the universe looks like in X-rays or gamma rays, we need to go up above the Earth's atmosphere to get to detect this light. And I also like to compare this with a picture called Starry Night by Van Gogh. If you break the picture down into its component colours, it's very hard to see what's happening. But it's not until you put all the colours together that you get the complete picture. And it's exactly the same looking at the universe in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. This is an image of the sun. I think this is the sun in extreme UV, this is sun in UV, this is the sun in infrared, and this is the sun maybe in X-rays. I might have got those a bit muddled, I can't remember. But by looking at different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, you see a very, very, very different image of the sun. And that's why we put these telescopes out in space. To get a complete picture of the universe, we need to sort of move away and get all these different bands of radiation and combine them to have a true understanding of what's going on. Now, sometimes these things seem a little esoteric. Why are we doing this? But I think these solar images are particularly pertinent, because the sun goes through solar cycles, and the main cycle is over a period of 11 years. And so the sun will go through a solar minimum where there's not much activity, and it will go through a solar maximum. And we're approaching a solar maximum at the moment. At the end of 2013, will be a period of maximum solar activity. Now, we call it space weather, and it seems quite distant, but space weather really does affect us here on planet Earth. The sun gives out matter. It gives out things called coronal mass ejections. And these can be sort of 100 times the size of the Earth, and they are sort of spewed out from the sun. Well, as these charged particles travel through space, they can interact with the Earth's magnetic field. They can take out transformers of power stations. About 5 years ago, part of Montreal was in complete darkness for a number of hours because a transformer was effectively hit by one of these coronal mass ejections. So we have a whole plethora of satellites communicating us, doing safety work. We need to understand our space weather to make sure that when we know that a solar storm is coming, we can turn off our satellites and protect ourselves and our satellites. So things like this are becoming more and more pertinent to our everyday lives. But through this range of instrumentation we're using, we're getting an even better understanding of our universe. we thought that we thought the Earth was the centre of the universe. We thought the Sun was the centre of the universe. But now we know that we live in a galaxy called the Milky Way, which contains approximately 200 billion stars. Now, when I talk about a star, well, usually people think you go a point of light a very long way away. And if you come and actually take a journey and go close to a star, the stars we see in the night sky are actually suns like our sun. So they're the size of the sun, but they only look like points of light because they're such a long way away. So when I say that there are 200 billion stars in our galaxy, that means 200 billion suns. And to me, it starts bringing up questions about aliens and what's out there. Now, my dream was one day to travel to the stars. And one of the things I've been trying to find out is how long is that going to take with current technology? And for that, I like to use what I call the Interstellar trip planner. Now, with this, this is a tool I often use with kids, and I sort of get volunteers up. But what you do is you sort of you plug in your destination. So I want to go to the moon, and I want to get there by car. Okay, but what this does is it will calculate the journey time. So going to the moon by car, if I plan the trip, it will take 22 weeks. That doesn't sound that unreasonable, really. But let's say I wanted to go to Saturn by bullet train. How long is that going to take? Well, probably considerably longer, 470 years. But my favourite one is if I want to travel to our next door neighbour star. So in our galaxy, 200 billion stars. The next door neighbour star is called Proxima Centauri. It's what they call 4.28 light years away. So if I want to travel to our next door neighbour star, and I want to travel as fast as we can with current technology, that's travelling at Voyager speed. So Voyager was a mission launched in the 1970s. The Voyager spacecraft had been travelling through space and had just about reached the edge of our solar system. And they're currently travelling at about 10.5 miles a second. Now, I travelled up from London to York yesterday, and it took about 2 hours. I would like to be able to travel at 10.5 miles a second. But what I wanted to do is find out how long that journey is going to take. Can anyone guess? Does anyone think is it going to be longer than the 470 years? Okay. Can anyone hazard a guess of how long they think it's going to take? Okay, well, let's actually plan the trip. So for us to travel from our star, the Sun, to the next door neighbour star, the journey will actually take 76,000 years. There goes my dream. So this is the problem. And even with the current technology, 76,000 years to get to the next door neighbour star is just too far away. So what I like to do is think of other ways of getting there. If we really want to get to the stars, how are we going to do it? And people have come up with a number of different ideas, and many of these ideas are used in science fiction. The idea of space cities. So rather than having a spaceship, like a Big Brother spaceship or something like that, you have a city populated with people, and the city will travel through the stars. Now, for this city to get to the next door neighbour star, 76,000 years. So that means that we go on, let's say, okay, you guys are going to go in the space city. We go on board the space city and we start the journey. And slowly but surely, we die off and our kids continue the journey. And slowly but surely they die off and their kids continue the journey. And so we, at the start of the journey, never reach the destination. But hopefully our great, anyway, you get the idea, grandkids make the journey. But I've got a 3-year-old daughter. And I don't know if I could. I always like to show you a picture of her. Actually, sometimes she does these talks with me, but she heckles me too much now, so I don't bring her along. But the thing is, I don't know if I could have the heart to resign her to a life like that. Never to see a planet, always to be travelling. Not at the end of the journey, not at the beginning of the journey, but just one of the transitory people in between. So although it's an interesting idea, it doesn't appeal to me at all. But then there's a more exciting science. The science of wormholes. I don't know if there are any Doctor Who fans in the room. I can see a few sage dogs in Doctor Who. Often at the beginning of the programme they show something, a series of tunnels. Often from speaking to the people who make Doctor Who, that is considered to be as a series of wormholes. Now, a wormhole is a very interesting concept. It's an idea that sort of came out of Einstein's general theory of relativity. And sorry, I'm going to get a piece of paper because it's easier to show them. What a wormhole looks at is actually distorting space-time. So Einstein came up with the idea of actually taking space, 3D space, and time, and putting it together in what he called space-time. And so this sheet of paper represents space-time. Actually, it's got one of my daughter's scribbles on it. But let's say we want to travel from A to B. In the conventional sense, we just go, the straight route. But if you can distort space-time, then rather than travelling from A to B, rather than the conventional route, you can go from A to B and make them much, much closer together. Therefore, travelling vast distances, so a journey of 76,000 years could be narrowed down to maybe even a few minutes. So the idea of a wormhole is very, very appealing. But the problem is, although there are theoretical calculations that indicate that wormholes might be out there, we've never seen one in space. And we think that the sort of energy you might need to create a wormhole might be sort of the output from the sun for a year. So wormholes are a nice idea, but they're not out there yet. But then it takes us even to other ideas. The idea is that if we have 200 billion stars in our galaxy, and each one of these stars is a sun like our sun, that means that, let's say on average, there's only 2 planets around each one of those stars. How many planets are in our galaxy? And then if you start looking at the number of planets in our galaxy, then you start looking at, well, why would life just occur here on Earth? With that many planets in our galaxy, it's a numbers game. It's quite likely that life isn't just going to occur here, but life might occur somewhere else in our galaxy. And a scientist called Drake, probably about sort of 50 years ago, tried to come up with an equation to actually look at the probability of finding life in the galaxy. And he was looking at sort of various factors, the rate of star formation in the galaxy, the probability of actually life taking form and forming on a planet, the probability of that life becoming intelligent. And then also, of actually, because he actually works for SETI, and the probability of actually contacting life. Because the galaxy and the universe is so big, it takes a finite amount of time for light to travel across the galaxy. So when I look at some of the distant stars, they don't look as they did now. When we look out at the sun and we see the sun, we actually see the sun as it was 9 minutes ago, because it's taken 9 minutes for the light to reach us. So when we look at some of these stars, they might not even exist anymore. So the probability of aliens actually coming to planet Earth and actually finding intelligent life, well, that might be a bit of a challenge anyway. But I like the idea that the aliens came when the dinosaurs were here and they said, no, don't like the look of these, or let's go. And so it's also having sort of concurrent civilizations, so that you actually have contact when you've got 2 civilizations that can actually communicate. So we can look at things like this. And also, aliens. I love the idea of aliens. And usually when we think of aliens, they're us, but slightly different. Us with 3 eyes and a sort of green antenna. But one of the exercises I was doing recently was I was trying to do some astrobiology. Now, astrobiology is looking at what might be out there. It's a very exciting time in astronomy, because over the years we've been looking out there, we've been looking at our galaxy, we've actually been sending probes, we're looking in our solar system, we've been sending probes to various planets in our solar system looking for life, and we haven't detected anything at the moment. But now what we're doing is we're not just detecting, we're not just looking for life in our galaxy, in our solar system, we're actually trying to detect planets going around other stars. So we're looking at other solar systems, and the planets going around other stars in those solar systems. These are called exoplanets. And to date, we've found about 500, 600 of these exoplanets going around other stars. Now, one of the things I mentioned was the OWL telescope, the 100-metre telescope. In the future, maybe we'll actually be able to use a telescope like that to do some spectroscopy and actually try and pick up the chemical fingerprints that make up life. So actually probe an atmosphere of another planet and look at the chemical fingerprints that might indicate that there might be life on that planet. Now, how we get to that planet is another matter altogether, but to actually know that we're not alone would be quite comforting. A survey was done by the Eden Television Group probably about 2 or 3 months ago, and they went out to the public and said, what is the scientific question you would most like answered? And I think people were expecting a cure for cancer, is there a God? But the question that came out in every section of the country was, are we alone in the universe? I think we're almost fundamentally programmed to ask this, and I think we might be getting closer to an answer by finding these exoplanets. And part of that programme, of the Eden Television, I was actually asked to come up with a concept of an alien. And from our research in the deep waters of the ocean, we are finding life where we didn't think it was at all possible. Life where we just didn't think life was possible. So now, what I'd like to do is think of life in the universe occurring in places we don't think is possible. We often try and look for Earth-like planets in what we call the Goldilocks zone, where you find liquid water. But I say, never mind that. Perhaps we can have beings living in methane gases that are the size of a football pitch, and they're made of silicon, so they absorb light, and they suck in chemicals and sort of reproduce that way. I think our concept of life is changing, mainly because of what we're finding out there. But I've been talking about the galaxy, but there is the whole of the universe to consider. And this is some footage called the Hubble Deep Field. Now, about 10 years ago, the Hubble Space Telescope did something very, very odd. It was actually commissioned, and I met the chap who commissioned this work. It was commissioned to look at what we thought was empty space. And it was commissioned to look at this empty space for about 6 whole days to get a really, really long exposure. Because just like with your camera, if you use a long exposure, you can pick up really dim and faint objects. So we did the exposure, we got the data, and we got it back, and we said, okay, what we thought was empty space isn't actually empty at all. And we sort of saw all these spots of light. And then we realised that each one of these spots of light is a galaxy. So what we thought, this was sort of, if you take a millimetre square of paper and hold it at arm's length, that's about the size of space we were looking at. And we saw all these galaxies. So from that sort of millimetre of space at arm's length, we can scale up for the whole of the universe and work out how many galaxies are in the universe. And when we do this, we come up with a pretty astounding number. Because at the moment, we think in the universe, there are approximately 100 billion galaxies. Now, we live in a galaxy called the Milky Way, which contains 200 billion stars. So, if there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe, it starts making my head hurt. I think about this when I'm trying to sleep at night, because it's better than counting sheep. So, if there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe, and each galaxy, let's say on average, is only 50 billion stars, and each one of those stars has only 2 planets, how many planets are in the universe? So, if we think there's probably life in the galaxy, there's almost got to be life in the universe, because there's so much universe out there, so many planets, so many stars. And I find that quite mind-boggling. But sometimes, to bring it all back to Earth, sometimes when I tell people these facts and figures, they feel sort of, scared and frightened, because it's almost as if the universe is too big and I can't take it all in. But for me, it has the opposite effect. I just feel really astoundingly glad to be part of something that is so amazing. And so, my other message is, when you look at the universe and you look at planet Earth, the one thing that space always did for me is it sort of transcended the earthly barriers. As a black kid growing up in London, I always felt that I didn't quite belong anywhere. I wasn't Nigerian, I wasn't British, I didn't really belong anywhere. But one thing that space did for me is it takes away the barriers. We are one world, we are one people, we are one globe. And when you put it into the context of the universe, you really feel that that is true. Thank you very much for listening.